As chairperson of Arts at Clark, together with Library Director Gail Bogle and tonight's presenter Wendy Frieden, we would like to welcome you all to Clark Memorial Library's 4th Artists in Conversation event. This is our monthly remote program to provide a connection between local artists and the Bethany community. Before we begin, we would like you to know that after last summer's very successful drive-through art exhibit, the Clark Memorial Library is planning our 2nd annual outdoor art exhibit scheduled for August 15th, rain date August 22nd. Visit our website, bethanylibrary.org, for videos of last year's exhibit and more info about this summer's event. In just a few minutes, Wendy will give her presentation. Afterwards, there will be time for questions, comments, and some discussion. Please save your questions for the end or use the chat feature to submit questions during the presentation. So first, let me tell you a little bit about tonight's guest. Wendy Frieden has been creating with fabric and textiles since she was a young girl. Both her grandmothers were expert seamstresses, and her mother is a seamstress and fabric artist. From these women, she learned many techniques, including dressmaking, tailoring, embroidery, and hand sewing. After many years of clothing design for herself and others, in the 1990s, she embraced quilting as her passion and never looked back. She is primarily self-taught and finds sewing fabrics together to create her art to be very satisfying. As a former software engineer, she enjoys the geometric interplay of shapes and colors that quilting affords. Combining bits of old and new fabric into something beautiful and useful reminds her of the thrift of her grandmothers. After years of quilting with a small domestic machine, she began longarm quilting several years ago and now creates her own quilts, as well as helps others finish their quilts. Her quilts have been exhibited at local shows and galleries, and she has had a quilt exhibited at the National Quilting Museum in Paducah, Kentucky. She has also made dozens of quilts for charitable organizations and events. Please welcome Wendy Frieden. Okay.
Well, thank you very much. This evening, I want to share with you my sewing and quilting background and what inspires me to make all the scrappy quilts that I make. Both of my grandmothers saved fabric scraps. My mother saves fabric scraps. My stepmother, who doesn't even sew, saves fabric scraps. Is it any surprise that I save fabric scraps as well? First, some definitions. A quilt is generally defined as a warm bed covering made of padding enclosed between layers of fabric and kept in place by lines of stitching, typically applied in a decorative design. I consider a scrappy quilt as one made entirely from leftover bits of fabric or from other projects, perhaps from other quilts or garment making. Sometimes a scrap quilt includes some new fabric, perhaps as a background fabric. So this quilt has lots of scrappy fabrics, but it's got one background fabric, the black, that's consistent throughout. Scrappy quilts make me think of the women in my family as well as women from long ago. I most enjoy working with bright colors and lots of variety. For me, the appeal of quilt making is the process of making something both beautiful and useful. I'm happiest when my quilts are used and loved. My paternal grandmother was very thrifty, but she had lived through the Depression, and that was what was done. Here's Grandma and Grandpa Ebling in Chicago with myself and my two brothers. She lived in Chicago and I lived in Seattle, so I only saw her once or twice each year. Her sewing machine was set up in the corner of her bedroom, and when I visited, she would show me the pajamas, doll quilts, and cuddle quilts she made for children in the local hospital. She usually made tied quilts from squares and rectangles, cutting them to the sizes dictated by the fabric scraps, fitting them together however they fit. So this is one that she made out of light prints of fabrics. And the left one is pieces of wool, which she used as a car quilt. And the one on the right is a lot of polyesters and some cottons left over from garment making. When I was young, she made me a special quilt for my bed using a traditional pattern and scraps from many of my clothes. My maternal grandmother, Nana, was also thrifty, but created in a completely different way. Here she is with myself and my younger brother. She was an expert seamstress and made many of my dresses when I was young, including a special Christmas dress each year. That was a perk of being the only granddaughter. She was meticulous in her technique and could knit, crochet, and sew to perfection. I spent several summers living at the farm, helping cook for the harvest crew, and after the dishes were put away, she taught me to sew and crochet beads. As I became more interested in quilting and she aged into her 90s, I completed one of her unfinished projects and enjoy remembering Nana as I use it. This quilt was mostly made from feed sack fabrics from the 1930s, and all the big triangle units were sewn together and set in a box, along with a piece of bright yellow fabric. I added the yellow triangles and the quarter stones in the border and finished it and was able to share it with her while she was still alive. There was a triangle template in the box cut out of a cereal box, and it was lettered with my grandfather's calligraphy. My grandfather was also creative. He did beautiful calligraphy on cards and signs in town, and he painted with oils beautiful scenes of farms and the fields he knew. The walls of their house were covered with his work. My mother, Claudia, as taught by Nana, is also an expert seamstress. She was involved in 4-H as a girl and won many awards for her sewing. My mother graduated with a degree in home economics, but when my brothers and I were young, she earned a master's degree in fine art from the University of Washington. This is my mom and dad. Her creative activities veered toward painting, collage, and textile fabrications rather than traditional sewing. So for example, this is a button table that she created. She had the base fabricated and she sandblasted the button design on the glass. And in the display area is a collage of buttons and silk neckties. She taught art classes for children out of our home when I was young, and later taught elementary art at a private school. Sewing with my mother was fun. She encouraged me to try new patterns and techniques. Fabric and art materials were always abundant around our house. My mother often does perfect work, but I appreciated learning from her that sometimes done is better than perfect. My first projects around the age of 5 were felt bean bags made on a battery-operated children's sewing machine. I would carefully stuff the bags using a funnel and dried beans. My brothers often complained that the machine was too noisy as we sat together watching TV. I made many dolls and toys. Here's a few of them, even selling some of my plush dogs at a craft fair in the 7th and 8th grade. I sewed many of my own clothes in junior high and high school. All the fabric scraps from clothing projects were carefully saved and rolled up in our fabric bin, waiting for another project. My father, an engineer, was also handy with home repairs and a fabulous woodworker. He was happy to help with our creative projects, making decorative frames for my mother's artwork and beautiful wood furniture for my home. I made my first quilt when I was in high school, and I still have it. Looking through Nana's quilt books and pulling fabrics from our fabric bin, I made some applique animals sashed in gingham, fabrics right out of the 1970s. It was very lightly hand quilted. I entered the quilt in a local craft fair and was delighted to see it hanging in the outdoor show. I overheard some ladies comment that there wasn't very much quilting, which I still remember 40 years later. They were right, there was not very much quilting, but I've always been careful not to make negative comments about anything hanging in a show. You never know who might be listening. I took that quilt to college and kept it on my dorm room bed. After college, I moved to Dallas to work at Texas Instruments as a software engineer. I always liked math and science as well as creative pursuits, but realized math and science would be a much easier way to make a living. The summer before I moved to Texas, I made my second quilt to use in my new apartment. I did quilt as you go before I knew what that was, referring to some books and making it up as I went along. I used solids with black for the stars with lots of polyester blends. I usually use only cottons in my work now, but quilting was not as popular then and fabrics were harder to find. In my 20s, I made many of my work clothes. I made a few baby quilts for friends, but most of my sewing was clothing. I always liked to be busy with my hands, and I also did knitting, cross stitch, and even some copper enameling. After I married and moved to Connecticut, I was busy with my new home and my new job in the software industry. Then I had a daughter and next a son. The internet bubble burst and I was laid off. I was busy with 2 young children. I was grateful that I could stay home with them. However, I was going a little stir crazy, talking only with toddlers, so I set up the guest room with my sewing machine. My husband and I fashioned a cutting table that fit over the guest room bed. I could sew and be creative during nap time and close the door when other duties called. I sewed clothing and costumes for my children. And I started attending a monthly 1-hour Saturday sampler class at a local quilt store. This is when I really caught the quilting bug. I made an alphabet quilt from one of my 1970s books for my daughter's first big girl bed, then a map and train quilt for my son. About this time, my bin of fabric scraps started to become a stash. As my children grew, I would sew while they were playing. Sometimes they would wander into the sewing room and help in many ways. They would arrange pre-cut squares, make layout suggestions, or sort my jumbled and unorganized threads into rainbow color order. My son sat on my lap and pushed the buttons to stitch 1 inch of each decorative stitch on my machine. I love their help as well as making things for them. So this is one of the early quilts I made when I started going to the Saturday sampler class. And my daughter really liked it, but she wanted it in colors of her own. So I gave her some graph paper with the layout, and she put the colors in where she chose and chose the fabrics from my stash. This is another quilt. It's called a jewel box pattern that I made with my daughter's assistance. Excuse me for a sec. She helped choose all the fabrics that went into it. And once I had the blocks made, she laid it out so that it was just so like she wanted it. This tessellating tea quilt, my son helped me with because the T for Timothy, his name. I had imagined scattering the blue and green teas throughout the quilt, but he was very insistent that all the blues should be on one side and all the greens should be on the other side. And when they didn't come out even, if you see, look on the right side, there's 5 blue teas in the form, on the shape of a T in amongst the green ones. That was very Tim to have a layout such as that. Once my children started nursery school, I had a few hours to myself and found a Project Linus, I found a Project Linus group in Stratford. These women meet each Wednesday in a church hall, putting together simple quilts with pieced fronts and fleece backs. I enjoyed the companionship and ability to create cuddle quilts out of the many boxes of donated fabrics. The growth of the internet and creative blogs provided me with tremendous inspiration. Instead of rolling up scraps, I started cutting my scraps into several commonly used sizes and easily put together blocks and quilts using those pre-cut pieces. Here's some examples of some online swaps I participated in. The one on the left, a number of people, most of them in Washington State, made blocks that reminded them of places in Washington State. And since it was where I grew up, and I was now living in Connecticut, I kind of missed Washington a bit. And then we exchanged by mail and sent blocks back and forth. So only a couple of those blocks did I actually make. Other people made them, but I made the trees and I made the words to put it all together. And on the right side is a different kind of exchange where a woman on her blog once a month would put a pattern for a quilt block and instruct you how many to make. And it wasn't until the end of the year that you could kind of see how it all became a farm scene, such that it was. So that can also be called kind of a mystery quilt, in that you don't really know what you're making until the final reveal at the end. So a lot of my quilts start with inspiration from a guild teacher or a workshop or an online image, and then I add my own twist. Once my son started kindergarten in the fall of 2006, I joined the Connecticut Peacemakers Quilt Guild. I was amazed by a room full of enthusiastic and talented quilters and thrilled by the monthly inspiration provided by show and tell and the speakers. I took many interesting workshops and found my skills grew in many areas. In 2008, I attended my first guild retreat and was thrilled with the fun and laughter had by all, while accomplishing all sorts of progress on our quilting projects. As I struggled to machine quilt on my domestic machine, another guild member invited me to use her stand-up longarm machine after the retreat. This kind of machine easily accommodates a queen-size quilt. Rather than moving the fabric under the machine, the machine moves on tracks and the fabric is stationary. The first time I tried the longarm, it was a delight. I felt like I was doodling on the fabric with thread, and I loved what I could accomplish. From 2010 to 2014, I chaired my guild's comfort quilt committee. Making quilts for others and sharing our love of quilting resonated with me. Designing simple but cute quilts, picking and choosing from the guild's large selection of donated fabrics for the kits, and delivering quilts to worthy organizations for distribution was a treat. Most of the quilts, or many of the quilts that our guild donates, go to Paul Newman's Hole in the Wall gang camp, where each of the campers has a quilt on their bed, and they are able to take that quilt home with them after their time at camp as a memento. So a lot of these quilts, I'm going to go through some of the charity quilts that I've made, but it's fun to think about the campers having them and enjoying looking at the fabrics, or maybe sort of an I Spy kind of quilt. Each of the beds in my own home already has more than enough quilts, so I'm always glad to have an excuse to keep quilting and sharing my creations with others. Here's one that's called a box kite pattern, but you can see it's very scrappy, although it's tied together with the orange sashing kind of calms it down a little bit. Two other bright and scrappy quilts. The one on the left, each of the squares is a different fabric, so it can be an I Spy quilt. I made these two during the last year. I had these panels from national parks, and as we all know, nobody was going anywhere, but it was fun to remember good trips I had taken with my family to national parks. And I made all the fun little trees to kind of fill it in and remember good trips that we had taken. This is kind of called a kitchen sink scrappy quilt, in that there's really everything in here, every color, but the light and dark blue kind of calm it down a little bit and add some consistency. Here are some quilts from kits I put together. They're made by various guild members, but it's kind of fun to see the same pattern in a lot of different fabrics. And some monochromatic quilts. Lots of fun fabrics and And a lot of times black and white, you can add a color to black and white and give it a whole fun pop and different look. I continue to use my friend's long arm from time to time to finish comfort quilts and some of my own. And I decided to take the plunge when a guild member advertised her used machine in our newsletter. Our home has a large unfinished basement with plenty of room for a machine, although in 2013, it was also full of finished comfort quilts and comfort quilt supplies. My family called the basement the fabric cave around that time. In order to improve my machine quilting skills, I quilted dozens of comfort quilts, and I signed up to be a long arm volunteer for Quilts of Valor. Quilts of Valor is an organization that presents veterans with quilts, generally patriotic themed, but not always, to thank them for their service and to honor them for their service. In November 2015, one of the Quilts of Valor I made from start to finish hung as part of a 33 quilt to comfort and honor exhibit at the National Quilting Museum in Paducah. And at the end of that exhibit, all of those 33 quilts were awarded to veterans. So I'll show a few of the Quilts of Valor I've done from start to finish. And most of mine I do in the patriotic colors. This was a quilt along on the internet in 2020. A woman designed this pattern and was giving instructions how to make it, which I made in patriotic colors. But during this last year, there's been a lot of activity on the internet and a lot of exchanging of ideas and encouragement and quilt alongs as everyone's been staying at home and sewing from their stash. And I was doing that as well. Another quilt along from last year, which I did in patriotic colors. Our guild did a few group quilts for Quilts of Valor. So the one on the left, the small stars are made by several different members. And I kind of like how these kind of interconnect with different colors. You'll see this same quilt in a different colorway in just a few moments. I took classes at the Machine Quilting Exposition in New Hampshire to improve my long arm skills, and I loved learning from many talented quilters. In 2017, I upgraded to a bigger long arm machine. And when deciding whether to vacuum the kitchen or spend time in the basement quilting, the basement almost always wins. When I served as the guild president from 2014 to 2016, I passed the comfort quilt baton to a new team, but I still enthusiastically make comfort quilts. A few years ago, I started to organize my scraps by color, and I made some monochromatic or two-color scrap quilts. And I like how the cohesiveness of that kind of design. Scrappy fits well with using what I have. Needing recipients for some of my Scrappy quilts, I made 10 graduation quilts for my daughter's friends in 2018. I enjoyed getting input from my daughter and including fabrics in the quilts to reflect her friends' color preferences and interests. So I'll show a few of those close up. This one was for a young woman who was interested in journalism. So I was able to find some fabrics that had words and type print. This girl's favorite color was yellow, so that was easy to find lots of different yellows in my stash. Some rainbow stars. And diamonds. And another one of the interlocking stars in bright colors, which I think that's just kind of a fun pattern. I find lots of reasons to make quilts. These two quilts were used 2 different years at a fundraising auction in St. Louis. an organization that my mother-in-law is involved with. This labyrinth quilt on the left, I made for my son when he went off to college for his dorm room bed. I love the graphic design. It's not an original design of mine, but I love how it turned out. Although when it's in a dorm room, it's a little hard to see the 3D effect. And then on the right, I had a commission to make the same quilt half size so that it could be a wall hanging. And that turned out nicely. This quilt, the center square was inspired by a workshop I took at my guild. And then the applique square sat in my sewing room for a couple of years until I got inspired of what to do to add on to it and make it into, this is kind of a small throw size or large wall hanging quilt. Our quilt guild often has challenges, so there'll be some sort of criteria set out and people are encouraged to make a quilt that meets that criteria. Usually they're table toppers or wall hangings, although sometimes people make large quilts. This one the challenge was circles, and in addition to the circles on top of the black and white, I did circle quilting so you can see the spirals of the circle and the quilting behind. This challenge was for our guild's 40th or ruby anniversary. I made a small quilt that resembles a ruby gemstone with 40 squares around the outside for the 40 years. This quilt the challenge was Drunkard's Path, which is a traditional quilt pattern, which is a quarter circle set into a square background. But I kind of played with the colors fading from one to the other and kind of an overlapping image. And I have fun doing some quilting on it, some fun quilting on it as well. Another quilt started at a guild workshop. I think I made 4 of those spiky New York Beauty blocks, and then they sat around for a while. And when I pulled it back out, I decided to do a whole different layout than the instructor had originally intended and changed the fabrics a lot and had a lot of fun doing some detailed quilting on the finished piece. This is just a fun, bright quilt with the polka dot fabrics. I've always been partial to polka dot fabrics, and these ones just talk to me. My daughter really liked the purple triangle quilt, so when she was that I made for her friend. So when she was choosing a quilt for her dorm room bed, she wanted that same pattern, but in different colors. And if you look at the edge of this quilt, there are half triangles, and so you have to. So in the process of making this quilt, you cut off all those halves, and then you have a pile of leftovers. So I took all the leftover triangle pieces and strips and made this scrappy little bright comfort quilt. The back of my daughter's quilt has a temperature quilt. She spent 10 months in Moldova, and each day that she was gone, I noted the temperature when she was there. And so for each day, the large triangle is the high temperature of the day, and the 2 smaller triangles are the low temperature of the day. I assigned a temperature range to each color. And so you can see when she got there in September, it was warmer, and then it got into the cooler months, and then it started to warm up again in May by the time she got home. Another quilt inspired by people on the internet. One gal, every Tuesday, she was putting on her blog a pattern for a small quilt block. She called it Tiny Tuesday because each of these squares is 5 inches. And so I followed along, and then at the end of the year, came up with my own way to arrange them and make them into a quilt. The left is when I was playing with making free-pieced words, and I challenged some friends to do it as well and had them give me blocks that had words for sweet treats, my dessert quilt. And the right, the fabric, it was a fabric line, a commercial fabric line based on designs from Guatemala. And the prints made me really happy. I just loved playing with those prints and remembering a trip I took actually way back in high school to Guatemala. Well, the colors really reflected things that I remembered. This was a curved piecing workshop and I made this table runner. I also took a workshop with someone who was making map quilts, and in the course she was talking about a map of coastal Connecticut, but I adapted her techniques to make a map of Bethany, Connecticut, and had kind of fun looking at the map and figuring out the green spaces and kind of the major roads. This one, somebody purchased it, so I made another one for myself on the left, and I made one for an auction on the right. I also made a map of Dusty, Washington, which is the small town nearest to my grandparents' farm. I used Google Maps and looked at the images of the field contours to figure out kind of some dividing lines and different ideas for the fields and crops that were around there. I've made some quilts with window wall hanging. This photograph actually is of Lake Bethany, or Lake Chamberlain here in Bethany. I took a photograph and transferred it onto fabric and then cut it up and put it into this attic window type of setting. It's also fun to transfer a pile of old t-shirts into a fun memory quilt. The one on the left was for my son and the one on the right was for my daughter. I've made some photo memory quilts for anniversary celebrations. And this last year, I found myself making quilts almost exclusively for my stash. Staying busy during the pandemic gave me a creative outlet and a distraction from the difficult things going on in so many people's lives. When the pandemic locked down the state, I started making small house blocks, one each day. Some days I would use the fabrics on my cutting table from a current project. Other days I would search through my stash to find something specific to reflect that day. I made a wall hanging with 68 houses to reflect the 68 days of the Connecticut quarantine. You can kind of see that one on the left. But the pandemic kept going, so I kept making houses, and I made several table runners and other wall hangings. I took some more of my houses and made them in a different setting. I called this kind of around the block or around the neighborhood. I made this house quilt to reflect a book title. That was another one of our guild challenges, The House on Mango Street. Houses are traditionally a well-known quilt block, and I looked through some of my older pictures and I had made other house quilts in the past. The one on the left was another exchange with different quilting friends. And when I had extra houses that didn't fit on the front, I made a row of houses on the back. And a wonky house from a guild workshop. I've made quilts for housewarming presents and baby presents, and I always love seeing the baby on the quilt. Graduation quilts, especially this past year for graduates who couldn't have a ceremony. this graduation quilt, I put music fabric on the back for music major. A bright and colorful wedding gift with a few, this one has a detail of some of the quilting. And what I like most is seeing my quilts used and loved and being useful. This past year, I also found myself very busy quilting for others. Sometimes quilters like to make tops, but do not have the equipment or the desire to complete the quilting part of the process. There were many driveway drop-offs and discussions at a 6-foot distance as they brought me their piece tops and backing. I added the creative quilting touch with my long arm machine and then returned the quilted sandwich to them to complete the binding. I often find myself practicing new quilting designs on a comfort quilt before using it on a client's quilt. So charity quilts and fancier quilts go hand in hand in my experience. So as beautiful fabrics continue to be printed and events worthy of quilts continue in people's lives, I look forward to many bright and scrappy quilt creations in my future. So now I welcome any questions that you might have.
So,
Wendy, it's Gail. I just put a question in the chat, but I have to ask this. You have a huge amount of quilts. Do you keep a list? Do you have any idea how many you've made in total?
Oh, I have spreadsheets. I have many lists. I've made lots. Several hundred at least.
Well, it's just amazing. They are all so beautiful.
Thank you.
I'm just amazed at the variety of, wait a minute, where am I? Well, anyways, yeah, I'm just amazed at the variety. I mean, when you had the show at the Bethany Library, that was amazing. And it's just, I recognize a few of them from then, but I mean, every single one is different. And there's your sense of color is just amazing. And, you know, it's just, they're just so beautiful. I'm just blown away by it. It's just wonderful, really wonderful. So on one of the chat questions, what is the average cost of and time to complete a typical quilt?
So I tend to be faster, I think, than some of my friends time-wise. I kind of like get really inspired and really kind of dig in and finish it. But of course, simpler quilts take longer. You know, a simpler quilt you could make in a week or two, and more complicated ones might take several months. And I know some people who do super detailed quilting and piecing, you know, could take several months to several years to make quilts. One of the things I really like about when I got involved with the comfort quilt is that they're simpler designs, but you still have fun effects with bright colors. And a lot of the fabric is donated, so then you don't have the cost. Because cotton fabrics now can run maybe up to $13 a yard if you buy it in quilt shops, and probably bed size quilt would use 10 to 12 yards. So that, I mean, so that's just the fabric. And then then you have the batting, and then if you're paying somebody else to quilt it, that can add a big chunk of change as well. So it can add up quickly. It's yet another expensive hobby.
Wendy, can you explain the quilt that's behind you?
Oh,
Oh, my background?
Yes.
Oh, so we had a Seminole piecing workshop, and so that is a close-up of my Seminole pieced rainbow quilt. I actually don't have a picture of the whole thing available, but I figured that was a better background than my messy office. But Seminole piecing was used by the Seminole Indians in Florida, and they were used sewing machines early on to make different designs that they would insert in clothing and skirts and shirts. But it's also a fun way to make wall hangings or even bed-size quilts.
Nice.
Oh, can I show you this long arm machine?
Sure.
I don't know if I have a picture that I can share on this computer. But if you Google long arm quilting machine, you'll probably get some images.
Wendy, I like when you describe your quilts, you're always saying the word play. So obviously it's not a drudgery or you have to, or you're trying to be perfect. You're playing, which I think is fantastic.
Yeah, no, it's just fun to me. It's just a good outlet to make me think about something else. Well, especially this last year, to think about something else. It's like, look at these fun blue and green fabrics. That's more fun to think about than what's happening in New York City.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, definitely.
And I was glad to see that the Hole in the Wall Gang Camp, where we've donated so many quilts, is going to be running this summer. And so some of our quilts will be used by campers, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I use a Handy Quilter long arm machine. There's a question about what is my brand, and mine is all hand driven. You can get computer driven machines where you can program in different designs, and then once you start it, you can kind of step back and it will do a few rows of quilting. But I actually like the freestyle of doing it myself. Rather than the computerized aspect. Even though I am comfortable with computers and did software for a while, I like the hand guiding of the machine.
How does that work? I mean, because this, the quilt is really large, and you said the quilt moves and the machine is still? The arm
No,
of
the machine is on tracks and the machine moves.
Oh.
And the quilt is stretched out, and so you can quilt about 15 inches of it at a time, the full width, but only about 15 inches, and then it's on rollers. And then you do the next 15 inches, and then the next 15 inches. And so, like, if you look at the quilt that's on the screen right now, you need to rotate it 90 degrees, but you can see the rows of elongated loops.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would do like 3 rows of those loops, and then I would advance the machine, and then I could do 3 more. So a lot of times if you look carefully at a quilt, you could see which way it was loaded into the machine and which direction it went.
So how do you control this so that you have this consistency? I mean, they're not all, I can see they're not all exactly the same. So if they had been computerized,
they would have been exactly the same.
Yeah, so that's the difference. So there's more variety.
So that's the difference, and that's why I made so many comfort quilts to practice. Because those kids at camp, they don't care if they're not even.
That's right.
Well, I like them better not even. I mean, I think
I'm fine with similar but not exact.
Yeah.
And you can use rulers to make your straight lines exactly straight. You kind of guide your machine along the edge of a plastic ruler. And so sometimes when I want to do more exacting designs, I will use rulers to do that.
And I assume you can vary the speed of the long arm machine?
You can.
Yeah, okay, because if you have something really complicated, you wouldn't want to go too fast.
Yeah, you want to slow it down. Exactly.
Yeah, they're just so beautiful. Mm. So are there any other questions, comments?
Your Quilts of Valor, are those all original designs by you, or?
No,
where did
not
your
all of them.
inspiration-
I mean, some of them are original, and
Mhm.
some of them, I know at least one of them, it was a pattern that was on the Quilt of Valor website. I think one of them was, like I said, that's sew along with the GE designs. So it's kind of mix and match.
Mhm.
So any other questions? Comments? All right, should we wrap it up here, or?
Maybe we can have her do it again.
do the whole thing again?
Maybe we can see the pictures again.
We do them backwards.
Yeah, that's fun. Thank you so much, Wendy. We're coming up on the 8 o'clock hour. Liz, would you like to wrap us up?
Yeah, okay. All right. Thank you so much, Wendy. This was just amazing. And I'm sure everybody enjoyed it too. Tonight's presentation wraps up our Spring Artists in Conversation series. We're planning another series of 4 presentations starting in September. So please visit our website, bethanylibrary.org, for more info about who's next and to register for the online Zoom events. Tonight's presentation has been recorded and will be available for viewing by mid next week on the library's website, as well as recordings of the previous 3 presentations. Thank you so much for joining us. And by the way, Wendy participated in last summer's exhibit, and she also will be participating in this summer's outdoor exhibit at the library on August 15th. So come and see what she's got new for us. Thank you very much and good night.